We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Chapter 9. Sometime during the night, an ambulance came and took Uncle Julian away, and I wondered if they missed his shawl, which was wound around Constance as she slept. I saw the ambulance lights turning into the driveway with the small red light on top, and I heard the distant sounds of Uncle Julian's leaving, the voices speaking gently because they were in the presence of the dead, and the doors opening and closing. They called to us 2 or 3 times, perhaps to ask if they might have Uncle Julian, but their voices were subdued, and no one came into the woods. I sat by the creek, wishing that I had been kinder to Uncle Julian. Uncle Julian had believed that I was dead, and now he was dead himself. Bow your heads to our beloved Mary Katherine, I thought, or you will be dead. The water moved sleepily in the darkness, and I wondered what kind of a house we would have now. Perhaps the fire had destroyed everything, and we would go back tomorrow and find that the past 6 years had been burned, and they were waiting for us, sitting around the dining room table, waiting for Constance to bring them their dinner. Perhaps we would find ourselves in the Rochester house, or living in the village, or on a houseboat on the river, or in a tower on top of a hill. Perhaps the fire might be persuaded to reverse itself and abandon our house and destroy the village instead. Perhaps the villagers were all dead now. Perhaps the village was really a great board game with the squares neatly marked out, and I had been moved past the square which read "Fire, return to start," and was now in the last few squares with only one move to go to reach home. Jonas's fur smelled of smoke. Today was Helen Clark's day to come to tea, but there would be no tea today, because we would have to neaten the house, although it was not the usual day for neatening the house. I wished that Constance had made sandwiches for us to bring down to the creek. And I wondered if Helen Clark would try to come to tea, even though the house was not ready. I decided that from now on, I would not be allowed to hand teacups. When it first began to get light, I heard Constance stirring on the leaves, and went into my hiding place to be near her when she awakened. When she opened her eyes, she looked first at the trees above her, and then at me, and smiled. "We're on the moon at last," I told her, and she smiled. "I thought I dreamt it all," she said. "It really happened," I said. Poor Uncle Julian. "They came in the night and took him away, and we stayed here on the moon." "I'm glad to be here," she said. "Thank you for bringing me." There were leaves in her hair and dirt on her face, and Jonas, who had followed me into my hiding place, stared at her in surprise. He had never seen Constance with a dirty face before. For a minute she was quiet, no longer smiling, looking back at Jonas, realizing that she was dirty. And then she said, "Merricat, what are we going to do?" "First, we must neaten the house, even though it is not the usual day." "The house," she said. "Oh, Merricat." "I had no dinner last night," I told her. "Oh, Merricat." She sat up and untangled herself quickly from Uncle Julian's shawl and the leaves. "Oh, Merricat, poor baby," she said. "We'll hurry." And she scrambled to her feet. "First, you had better wash your face." She went to the creek and wet her handkerchief and scrubbed at her face, while I shook out Uncle Julian's shawl and folded it, thinking how strange and backward everything was this morning. I had never touched Uncle Julian's shawl before. I already saw that the rules were going to be different, but it was out to be folding Uncle Julian's shawl. Later, I thought, I would come back here to my hiding place and clean it and put in fresh leaves. Merricat, you'll starve. We have to watch, I said, taking her hand to slow her. We have to go very quietly and carefully. Some of them may still be around waiting. I went first down the path, walking silently, with Constance and Jonas behind me. Constance could not step as silently as I could, but she made very little sound, and of course Jonas made no sound at all. I took the path that would bring us out of the woods, at the back of the house, near the vegetable garden. And when I came to the edge of the woods, I stopped and held Constance back while we looked carefully to see if there were any of them left. For one first minute, we saw only the garden and the kitchen door, looking just as always. And then Constance gasped and said, "Oh, Mary Cat," with a little moan. And I held myself very still, because the top of our house was gone. I remembered that I had stood looking at our house with love yesterday, and I thought how it had always been so tall, reaching up into the trees. Today the house ended above the kitchen doorway in a nightmare of black and twisted wood. I saw part of the window frame still holding broken glass, and I thought that was my window. I looked out that window from my room. There was no one there, and no sound. We moved together very slowly toward the house, trying to understand its ugliness and ruin and shame. I saw that ash had drifted among the vegetable plants. The lettuce would have to be washed before I could eat it, and the tomatoes. No fire had come this way, but everything, the grass and the apple trees and the marble bench and Constance's garden, had an air of smokiness, and everything was dirty. As we came closer to the house, we saw more clearly that the fire had not reached the ground floor, but had to be content with the bedrooms and the attic. Constance hesitated at the kitchen door, but she had opened it 1,000 times before, and had not surely to recognize the touch of her hand. So she took the latch and lifted it. The house seemed to shiver when she opened the door, although one more draught could hardly chill it now. Constance had to push at the door to make it open, but no burned timber crashed down, and there was not, as I have thought there might be, a sudden rushing falling together, as a house, seemingly solid but really made only of ash, might dissolve at a touch. "My kitchen," Constance said. "My kitchen." She stood in the doorway, looking. I thought that we had somehow not found our way back correctly through the night, that we had somehow lost ourselves and come back through the wrong gap in time, or the wrong door, or the wrong fairy tale. Constance put her hand against the doorframe to steady herself, and said again, "My kitchen, Mary Cat." "My stool is still there," I said. The obstacle which made the door hard to open was the kitchen table, turned on its side. I set it upright, and we went inside. 2 of the chairs had been smashed, and the floor was horrible with broken dishes and glasses and broken boxes of food and paper torn from the shelves. Jars of jam and syrup and catsup had been shattered against the walls. The sink where Constance washed her dishes was filled with broken glass, as though glass after glass had been broken there methodically, one after another. Drawers of silverware and cookingware had been pulled out and broken against the table and the walls. And the silverware that had been in the house for generations of Blackwood wives was lying bent and scattered on the floor. Tablecloths and napkins hemmed by Blackwood women and washed and ironed again and again, mended and cherished, had been ripped from the dining room sideboard and dragged across the broken plates, which had come from the top shelves in the cupboard, and our little sugar bowl with roses lay almost at my feet. Handles gone. Constance bent down and picked up a silver spoon. "This was our grandmother's wedding pattern," she said, and set the spoon on the table. Then she said, "The preserves," and turned to the cellar door. It was closed, and I hoped that perhaps they had not seen it or had perhaps not had time to go down the stairs. Constance picked her way carefully across the floor and opened the cellar door and looked down. I thought of the jars and jars, so beautifully preserved, lying in broken, sticky heaps in the cellar, but Constance went down a step or two and said, "No, it's all right. Nothing here's been touched." She closed the cellar door again and made her way across the sink to wash her hands and dry them on a dish towel from the floor. "First your breakfast," she said. Jonas sat on the doorstep in the growing sunlight, looking at the kitchen with astonishment. Once he raised his eyes to me, and I wondered if he thought that Constance and I had made this mess. I saw a cup not broken and picked it up and set it on the table, and then thought to look for more things which might have escaped. I remembered that one of our mother's Dresden figures had rolled safely onto the grass, and I wondered if it had hidden successfully and preserved itself. I would look for it later. Nothing was orderly, nothing was planned. It was not like any other day. Once Constance went into the cellar and came back with her arms full. "Vegetable soup," she said, almost singing, "and strawberry jam, and chicken soup, and pickled beef." She set the jars on the kitchen table and turned slowly, looking down at the floor. "There," she said at last, and went to a corner to pick up a small saucepan. Then, on a sudden thought, she set the saucepan down and made her way into the pantry. "Mary Cat," she called with laughter, "they didn't find the flour in the barrel, or the salt, or the potatoes." They found the sugar, I thought. The floor was gritty and almost alive under my feet. And I thought, of course they would go looking for the sugar and have a lovely time. Perhaps they had thrown handfuls of sugar at one another, screaming, Blackwood sugar, wanna taste?" "They got to the pantry shelves," Constance went on, "the cereals and the spices and the canned food." I walked slowly around the kitchen, looking at the floor. I thought they had probably tumbled things by the armload because cans of food were scattered and bent, as though they had been tossed into the air, and the boxes of cereal and tea and crackers had been trampled underfoot and broken open. The tins of spices were altogether thrown into a corner unopened. I thought I could still smell the faint spicy scent of Constance's cookies, and then saw some of them crushed on the floor. Constance came out of the pantry, carrying a loaf of bread. "Look what they didn't find," she said. "And there are eggs and milk and butter in the cooler." Since they had not found the cellar door, they had not found the cooler just inside, and I was pleased that they had not discovered eggs to mix into the mess on the floor. At one time, I found 3 unbroken chairs and set them where they belonged around the table. Jonas sat in my corner on my stool, watching us. I drank chicken soup from a cup without a handle. Constance washed a knife to spread butter on the bread. Although I did not perceive it then, time and the orderly pattern of our old days had ended. I do not know when I found the 3 chairs and when I ate buttered bread, whether I had found the chairs and then eaten bread, or whether I had eaten first, or even on both at once. Once Constance turned suddenly and put down her knife, and she started for the closed door to Uncle Julian's room, and then turned back, smiling a little, I thought I heard him waking, she said, and sat down again. We had not yet been out of the kitchen. We still did not know how much house was left to us or what we might find waiting beyond the closed doors into the dining room and the hall. We sat quietly in the kitchen, grateful for the chairs and the chicken soup and the sunlight coming through the doorway, not yet ready to go further. "What will they do with Uncle Julian?" I asked. "They will have a funeral," Constance said with sadness. "Do you remember the others?" "I was in the orphanage. They let me go to the funerals of the others. I can remember. They will have a funeral for Uncle Julian, and the Clarks will go, and the Carringtons, and certainly little Mrs. Wright. They will tell each other how sorry they are. They will look to see if we are there." I felt them looking to see if we were there, and I shivered. "They will bury him with the others." "I would like to bury something for Uncle Julian," I said. Constance was quiet, looking at her fingers, which lay still and long on the table. "Uncle Julian is gone, and the others," she said. "Most of our house is gone, Merricat. We are all that is left. Jonas. We're going to lock ourselves in more securely than ever. But today's the day Helen Clark comes to tea." "No," she said. "Not again. Not here." As long as we sat quietly together in the kitchen, it was possible to postpone seeing the rest of the house. The library books were still on their shelf, untouched, and I suppose that no one had wanted to touch books belonging to the library. There was a fine, after all, for destroying library property. Constance, who was always dancing, seemed now unwilling to move. She sat on at the kitchen table, with her hands spread before her, not looking around at the distraction, and almost dreaming, as though she never believed that she had wakened this morning at all. "We must neaten the house," I said to her uneasily, and she smiled across at me. When I felt that I could not wait for her any longer, I said, "I'm going to look," and got up and went to the dining room. She watched me, not moving. When I opened the door to the dining room, there was a shocking smell of wetness and burned wood and destruction, and glass from the tall windows lay across the floor, and the silver tea service had been swept off the sideboard and stamped into grotesque, unrecognizable shapes. Chairs were broken here, too. I remembered that they had taken up the chairs and hurled them at windows and walls. I went through the dining room and into the front hall. The front door stood wide open, and early sunlight lay in patterns along the floor of the hall, touching broken glass and torn cloth. After a minute, I recognized the cloth as the drawing-room draperies which our mother had once had made up 14 feet long. No one was outside. I stood in the open doorway and saw that the lawn was marked with the tires of cars and the feet which had danced, and where the hoses had gone there were puddles and mud. The front porch was littered, and I remembered the neat pile of partly broken furniture which Harler, the junk dealer, had set together last night. I wondered if he planned to come today with a truck and gather up everything he could, or if he had only put the pile together because he loved great piles of broken things and could not resist stacking junk wherever he found it. I waited in the doorway to be sure that no one was watching, and then I ran down the steps, across the grass, and found our mother's Dresden figurine unbroken, where it had hidden against the roots of a bush. I thought to take it to Constance. She was still sitting quietly at the kitchen table, And when I put the Dresden figurine down before her, she looked for a minute and then took it in her hands and held it against her cheek. "It was all my fault," she said. "Somehow, it was all my fault." "I love you, Constance," I said. "And I love you, Merricat. And will you make that little cake for Jonas and me? Pink frosting with gold leaves around the edge?" She shook her head, and for a minute I thought she was not going to answer me. And then she took a deep breath and stood up. "First," she said, "I'm going to clean this kitchen." "What are you going to do with that?" I asked her, touching the Dresden figurine with the very tip of my finger. "Put it back where it belongs," she said, and I followed her as she opened the door to the hall and made her way down the hall to the drawing-room doorway. The hall was less littered than the rooms because there had been less in it to smash, but there were fragments carried from the kitchen, and we stepped on spoons and dishes which had been thrown here. I was shocked when we came into the drawing-room to see our mother's portrait looking down on us graciously, while her drawing-room lay destroyed around her. The white wedding cake trim was blackened with smoke and soot, and would never be clean again. I disliked seeing the drawing-room even more than the kitchen or the dining room because we had always kept it so tidy, and our mother had loved this room. I wondered which of them had pushed over Constance's harp, and I remembered that I heard it cry out as it fell. The rose brocade on the chairs was torn and dirty, smudged with the marks of wet feet that had kicked at the chairs and stamped on the sofa. The windows were broken here too, and with the drapes torn down, we were clearly visible from outside. "I think we can close the shutters," I said, as Constance hesitated in the doorway, unwilling to come further into the room. I stepped out onto the porch through the broken window, thinking that no one had ever come this way before, and found that I could unhook the shutters easily. The shutters were as tall as the windows. Originally, it was intended that a man with a ladder would close the shutters when the summers were ended, and the family went away to a city house, but so many years had passed since the shutters were closed that the hooks had rusted, and I needed only to shake the heavy shutters to pull the hooks away from the house. I swung the shutters closed, but I could only reach the lower bolt to hold them. There were 2 more bolts high above my head, and perhaps some night I might come out here with a ladder, but the lower bolt would have to hold them for now. After I had closed the shutters on both tall drawing-room windows, I went along the porch and informally through the front door and into the drawing-room, where Constance stood in dimness now, without the sunlight. Constance went to the mantel and set the Dresden figurine in its place below the portrait of our mother. And for one quick minute, the great shadowy room came back together again, as it should be, and then fell apart forever. We had to walk carefully because of the broken things on the floor. Our father's safe lay just inside the drawing-room door, and I laughed, and even Constance smiled because it had not been opened and had clearly not been possible to carry it any further than this. "Foolishness," Constance said, and touched the safe with her toe. Our mother had always been pleased when people admired her drawing-room, but now no one would come to the windows and look in, and no one would ever see it again. Constance and I closed the drawing-room door behind us and never opened it afterwards. Constance waited just inside the front door while I went onto the porch again and closed the shutters over the tall dining-room windows, and then I came inside, and we shut and locked the front door, and we were safe. The hall was dark, with 2 narrow lines of sunlight coming through the 2 narrow glass panels set on either side of the door. We could look outside through the glass, but no one could see in, even by putting their eyes up close, because the hall inside was dark. Above us, the stairs were black and led into blackness or burned rooms with incredibly tiny spots of sky showing through. Until now, the roof had always hidden us from the sky, but I did not think there was any way we could be vulnerable for above, and closed my mind against the thought of silent winged creatures coming out of the trees above to perch on the broken burnt rafters of our house, peering down. I thought it might be wise to barricade the stairs by putting something, a broken chair perhaps, across. A mattress, soaked and dirty, lay halfway down the stairs, and this is where they had stood with the hoses and fought the fire back and out. I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up, wondering where our house had gone. The walls and the floors and the beds and the boxes of things in the attic. Our father's watch was burnt away, and our mother's tortoiseshell dressing set. I could feel a breath of air on my cheek. It came from the sky I could see, but it smelled of smoke and ruin. Our house was a castle, turreted and open to the sky. "Come back to the kitchen," Constance said. "I can't stay out here." Like children hunting for shells or two old ladies going through dead leaves looking for pennies, we shuffled along the kitchen floor with our feet, turning over broken trash to find things which were still whole and useful. When we had been along and across and diagonally through the kitchen, we had gathered together a little pile of practical things on the kitchen table, and there was quite enough for the two of us. There were 2 cups with handles and several without, and half a dozen plates and 3 bowls. We had been able to rescue all the cans of food undamaged, and the cans of spice went neatly back onto their shelf. We found most of the silverware and straightened most of it as well as we could, and put it back into its proper drawers. Since every Blackwood bride had brought her own silverware and china and linen into the house, we had always had dozens of butter knives and soup ladles and cake servers. Our mother's best silverware had been in a tarnish-proof box in the dining room sideboard, but they had found it and scattered it on the floor. One of our whole cups was green with a pale yellow inside, and Constance said that one could be mine. "I never saw anyone use it before," she said. "I suppose a grandmother or a great-great-aunt brought that set to the house as her wedding china. There once were plates to match. The cup which Constance chose was white with orange flowers, and one of the plates matched that. I remember when we used those dishes," Constance said. "They were the everyday china when I was very small. The china we used for the best then was white with gold edges. Then Mother bought new best china, and the white and gold china was used for every day, and these flower dishes went on the pantry shelf, with the other half-broken sets. These last few years, I've always used Mother's everyday china, except when Helen Clark came to tea. We will take our meals like ladies," she said, "using cups with handles." When we had taken out everything we wanted and could use, Constance got the heavy broom and swept all the rubble into the dining room. "Now we won't have to look at it," she said. She swept the hall clear so we could go from the kitchen to the front door without passing through the dining room. And then we closed all the doors to the dining room and never opened them again. I thought of the Dresden figurine standing small and courageous under our mother's portrait in the dark drawing room, and I remembered that we would never dust it again. Before Constance swept away the torn cloth that had been the drawing room drapes, I asked her to cut off a piece of the cord which had once drawn them open and shut, and she cut me a piece with a gold tassel on the end. I wondered if it might be the right thing to bury for Uncle Julian. When we had finished and Constance had scrubbed the kitchen floor, our house looked clean and new. From the front door to the kitchen door, everything was clear and swept. So many things were gone from the kitchen that it looked bare, but Constance put our cups and plates and bowls on a shelf and found a pan to give Jonas milk, and we were quite safe. The front door was locked, and the kitchen door was locked and bolted, and we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking milk from our 2 cups, and Jonas was drinking from his pan when a knocking started on the front door. Constance ran to the cellar, and I stopped just long enough to be sure that the kitchen door was bolted, and then followed her. We sat on the cellar stairs in the darkness and listened. Far away, at the front door, the knocking went on, and then a voice called, "Constance? Mary Katherine?" "It's Helen Clark," Constance said in a whisper. "Do you think she's come for her tea?" "No, never again." As we had both known she would, she came around the house, calling us. When she knocked on the kitchen door, we held our breath, neither of us moving, because the top half of the kitchen door was glass, and we knew she could see in. But we were safely on the cellar stairs, and she could not open the door. "Constance? Mary Katherine, are you in there?" She shook the door handle, as people do when they want a door to open, and think to catch it unaware and slip in before the lock can hold. "Jim," she said, "I know they're in there. I can see something cooking on the stove. You've got to open the door," she said, raising her voice. "Constance, come and talk to me. I want to see you." "Jim," she said, "they're in there, and they can hear me. I know it." "I'm sure they can hear you," Jim Clark said. "They can probably hear you in the village." "But I'm sure they misunderstood the people last night. I'm sure Constance was upset, and I must tell them that nobody meant any harm. Constance, listen to me, please. We want you and Mary Katherine to come to our house until we can decide what to do with you. Everything's all right, really, it is. We're going to forget all about it." "Do you think she will push over the house?" I whispered to Constance, and Constance shook her head wordlessly. "Jim, do you think you could break down the door?" "Certainly not. Leave them alone, Helen. They'll come out when they're ready." "But Constance takes these things so seriously. I'm sure she's frightened now." "Leave them alone." "They cannot be left alone. That is absolutely the worst possible thing for them. I want them out of there and home with me where I can take care of them." "They don't seem to want to come," Jim Clark said. Constance, I know you're in there. Come and open the door." I was thinking that we might very well put a cloth or a piece of cardboard over the window in the kitchen door. It simply would not do to have Helen Clark constantly peering in to watch pots cooking on the stove. We could pin the curtains together across the kitchen windows, and perhaps, if the windows were all covered, we could sit quietly at the table when Helen Clark came pounding outside, and not have to hide on the cellar stairs. "Let's leave," Jim Clark said. "They're not going to answer you." "But I want to take them home with me." "We did what we could. We'll come back another time when they feel more like seeing you." Constance, please answer me." Constance sighed and tapped her fingers irritably and almost noiselessly on the stair rail. "I wish she'd hurry," she said into my ear. "My soup is going to boil over." Helen Clark called again and again, going back around the house to their car, calling, "Constance, as though we might be somewhere in the woods, up a tree perhaps, or under the lettuce leaves, or waiting to spring out at her from behind a bush. When we heard their car start distantly, we came up out of the cellar, and Constance turned off her soup, and I went along the hall to the front door to be sure they had gone, and that the door was safely locked. I saw their car turn out of the driveway, and thought I could still hear Helen Clark calling, Constance. "She certainly wanted her tea," I said to Constance when I came back to the kitchen. "We have only 2 cups with handles," Constance said. "She will never take her tea here again." "It's a good thing Uncle Julian's gone, or one of us would have to use a broken cup. Are you going to neaten Uncle Julian's room?" "Merricat." Constance turned from the stove to look at me. "What are we going to do?" "We've neatened the house. We've had food. We've hidden from Helen Clark. What are we going to do? Where are we going to sleep? How are we going to know what time it is? What will we wear for clothes? Why do we need to know what time it is? Our food won't last forever, even the preserves. We can sleep in my hiding place by the creek. No, that's all right for hiding, but you must have a real bed. I saw a mattress on the stairs. From my old bed, perhaps. We can pull it down and clean it and dry it in the sun. One corner is burned. Good, said Constance. We went together to the stairs and took hold of the mattress awkwardly. It was unpleasantly wet and dirty. We dragged it, pulling together along the hall, with little scraps of wood and glass coming along with it, and got it across Constance's clean kitchen floor to the kitchen door. Before unlocking the door, I looked out carefully, and even when the door was open, I went out first to look around in every direction. But it was safe. We dragged the mattress out onto the lawn and put it in the sun near our mother's marble bench. Uncle Julian used to sit right here, I said. It would be a good day today for Uncle Julian to sit in the sun. I hope he was warm when he died. Perhaps he remembered the sun for a minute. I had a shawl. I hope he didn't wish for it. Merricat, I am going to plant something here where he used to sit. I'm going to bury something for him. What will you plant? A flower. Constance leaned and touched the grass softly. Some kind of yellow flower. It's going to look funny right in the middle of the lawn. We'll know why it's there, and no one will ever see it. And I will bury something yellow to keep Uncle Julian warm. First, however, my lazy Merricat, you will get a pot of water and scrub that mattress clean, and I will wash the kitchen floor again. We were going to be very happy, I thought. There were a great many things to do and a whole new pattern of days to arrange, but I thought we were going to be very happy. Constance was pale and still saddened by what they had done to her kitchen, but she had scrubbed every shelf and washed the table again and again, and washed the windows and the floor. Our dishes were bravely on their shelf, and the cans and unbroken boxes of food we had rescued made a substantial row in the pantry. I could train Jonas to bring back rabbits for stew, I told her. And she laughed, and Jonas looked back at her blandly. That cat is so used to living on cream and rum cakes and buttered eggs that I doubt if he could catch a grasshopper, she said. I don't think I could care for a grasshopper stew. At any rate, now I am making an onion pie. While Constance washed the kitchen, I found a heavy cardboard carton, which I took apart carefully, and so had several pieces of cardboard to cover the glass window in the kitchen door. The hammer and the nails were in the tool shed, where Charles Blackwood had put them after trying to mend the broken step, and I nailed cardboard across the kitchen door until the glass was completely covered and no one could see in. I nailed more cardboard across the 2 kitchen windows, and the kitchen was dark but safe. It would be safer to let the kitchen windows get dirty, I told Constance, but she was shocked and said, I wouldn't live in a house with dirty windows. When we had finished, the kitchen was very clean, but could not sparkle because there was so little light, and I knew that Constance was not pleased. She loved sunshine and brightness, and cooking in a light, lovely kitchen. We can keep the door open, I said. If we watch carefully all the time, we'll hear if any cars stop in front of the house. When I can, I said, I will try to think of a way to build barricades along the sides of the house so no one will be able to come around here to the back. I am sure Helen Clark will try again. At any rate, she can't look in now. The afternoon was drawing in. Even with the door open, the sunlight came only a short way across the floor. And Jonas came to Constance at the stove, asking for his supper. The kitchen was warm and comfortable and familiar and clean. It would be nice to have a fireplace in here, I thought. We could sit beside a fire, and then I thought, no, We have already had a fire. I will go and make sure that the front door is locked. The front door was locked, and no one was outside. When I came back into the kitchen, Constance said, "Tomorrow I will clean Uncle Julian's room. We have so little house left that it should all be very clean." "Will you sleep in there? In Uncle Julian's bed?" "No, Merricat. I want you to sleep in there. It's the only bed we have." "I'm not allowed in Uncle Julian's room." She was quiet for a minute, looking at me curiously, and then asked, "Even though Uncle Julian's gone, Merricat?" "Besides, I found the mattress and cleaned it, and it came from my bed. I want it on the floor in my corner." "Silly Merricat. Anyway, I'm afraid we'll both have the floor tonight. The mattress will not dry before tomorrow, and Uncle Julian's bed is not clean." "I can bring branches from my hiding place and leaves." "On my clean kitchen floor?" "I'll get a blanket, though, and Uncle Julian's shawl." "You're going out? Now? All that way?" "No one's outside," I said. "It's almost dark, and I can go very safely. If anyone comes, close the door and lock it. If I see that the door is closed, I will wait by the creek until I can come home safely. I will take Jonas for protection." I ran all the way to the creek, but Jonas was faster and was waiting for me when I got to my hiding place. It was good to run, and good to come back again to our house and see the kitchen door standing open and the warm light inside. When Jonas and I came in, I shut the door and bolted it, and we were ready for the night. "It's a good dinner," Constance said, warm and happy from cooking. "Come and sit down, Merricat." With the door shut, she had had to turn on the ceiling light, and our dishes on the table were neatly set. "Tomorrow I will try to polish the silverware," she said. "And we must bring in things from the garden." "The lettuce is full of ashes." "Tomorrow, too," Constance said, looking at the black squares of cardboard which covered the windows, "I am going to try to think of some kind of curtains to hide your cardboard. Tomorrow I will barricade the sides of the house. Tomorrow Jonas will catch us a rabbit. Tomorrow I will guess for you what time it is." Far away, in the front of the house, a car stopped, and we were silent, looking at one another. Now, I thought, now we will know how safe we are. And I got up and made sure the kitchen door was bolted. I could not see out through the cardboard, and I was sure they could not see in. The knocking started at the front door, but there was no time to make sure that the front door was locked. They knocked only for a moment, as though certain that we would not be in the front of the house. And then we heard them stumbling in the darkness as they tried to find their way around the side of the house to the back. I heard Jim Clark's voice, and another which I remembered was the voice of Dr. Levy. "Can't see a thing," Jim Clark said. "Black as sin out here." "There's a crack of light at one of the windows." Which one, I wondered? Which window still showed a crack? "They're in there all right," Jim Clark said. "No place else they could be. I just want to know if they're hurt or sick. Don't like to think of them shut up in there needing help." "I'm supposed to bring them home with me," Jim Clark said. They came back to the back door. Their voices were directly outside, and Constance reached out her hand across the table to me. If it seemed that they might be able to look in, we could run together for the cellar. "Damn place is all boarded up," Jim Clark said, and I thought, good, oh, that's good. I had forgotten that there would be real boards in the tool shed. I never thought of anything but cardboard, which is much too weak. "Miss Blackwood," the doctor called, and one of them knocked on the door. "Miss Blackwood, it's Dr. Levy." "And Jim Clark, Helen's husband. Helen's very worried about you." "Are you hurt? Sick? Do you need help?" "Helen wants you to come out to our house. She's waiting for you there." "Listen," the doctor said, and I thought he had his face up very close to the glass, almost touching it. He talked in a very friendly voice and quietly. Listen, no one's going to hurt you. We're your friends. We came all the way over here to help you and make sure that you were all right. And we don't want to bother you. As a matter of fact, we promise not to bother you at all, ever again, if you'll just once say that you're well and safe. Just one word. You can't let people go on worrying and worrying about you, Jim Clark said. Just one word, the doctor said. All you have to do is say you're all right. They waited. I could feel them pressing their faces close to the glass, longing to see inside. Constance looked at me across the table and smiled a little, and I smiled back. Our safeguards were good, and they could not see in. Listen, the doctor said, and he raised his voice a little. Listen, Julian's funeral's tomorrow. We thought you'd want to know. There are a lot of flowers already, Jim Clark said. You'd be really pleased to see all the flowers. We sent flowers and the Wrights and the Carringtons. I think you'd feel a little different about your friends if you could see the flowers we all sent Julian. I wondered why we would feel different if we saw who sent Uncle Julian flowers. Certainly Uncle Julian, buried in flowers, swarmed over by flowers, would not resemble the Uncle Julian we had seen every day. Perhaps masses of flowers would warm Uncle Julian dead. I tried to think of Uncle Julian dead and could only remember him asleep. I thought of the Clarks and the Carringtons and the Wrights pouring armfuls of flowers down onto poor old Uncle Julian, helplessly dead. You're not gaining anything by driving away your friends, you know. Helen said to tell you. Listen. I could feel them pushing against the door. No one's going to bother you. Just tell us, are you all right? We're not going to keep coming, you know. There's a limit to how much friends can take. Jonas yawned. In silence, Constance turned, slowly and carefully, back to face her place at the table, and took up a buttered biscuit and took a tiny, silent bite. I wanted to laugh and put my hands over my mouth. Constance eating a biscuit silently was funny, like a doll pretending to eat. Damn it, Jim Clark said. He knocked on the door. Damn it, he said. For the last time, the doctor said. We know you're in there. For the last time, will you just... Oh, come away, Jim Clark said. It's not worth all the yelling. Listen, the doctor said, and I thought he had his mouth against the door. One of these days you're going to need help. You'll be sick or hurt. You'll need help. Then you'll be quick enough to. Leave them be, Jim Clark said. Come on. I heard their footsteps going around the side of the house and wondered if they were tricking us, pretending to walk away, and then coming silently back to stand without sound, outside the door, waiting. I thought of Constance silently eating a biscuit inside and Jim Clark silently listening outside, and a little cold chill went up my back, and perhaps there would never be noise in the world again. Then the car started at the front of the house, and we heard it drive away, and Constance put her fork down on her plate with a little crash, and I breathed again and said, Where have they got Uncle Julian, do you suppose? At that same place, Constance said absently, in the city. Merricat, she said, looking up suddenly. Yes, Constance? I want to say I'm sorry. I was wicked last night. I was still and cold, looking at her and remembering. I was very wicked, she said. I never should have reminded you of why they all had died. Then don't remind me now. I could not move my hand to reach over and take hers. I wanted you to forget about it. I never wanted to speak about it ever. And I'm sorry I did. I put it in the sugar. I know. I knew then. You never use sugar. No. So, I I put it in the sugar. Constance sighed. Merricat, she said. We'll never talk about it again. Never. I was chilled, but she smiled at me kindly, and it was all right. I love you, Constance, I said. And I love you, my Merricat. Jonas sat on the floor and slept on the floor, and I thought it ought not to be so difficult for me. Constance should have had leaves and soft moss under her blanket, but we could not dirty the kitchen floor again. I put my blanket in the corner near my stool because it was the place I knew best, and Jonas got up onto the stool and sat there, looking down at me. Constance lay on the floor near the stove. It was dark, but I could see the paleness of her face across the kitchen. Are you comfortable? I asked her, and she laughed. I spent a lot of time in this kitchen, she said, but I never before tried lying on its floor. I've taken such good care of it that it has to make me welcome, I think. Tomorrow we'll bring in lettuce. Chapter 10. Slowly the pattern of our days grew and shaped itself into a happy life. In the mornings, when I awakened, I would go at once down the hall to make sure the front door was locked. We were most active in the very early morning because no one was ever around. We had not realized that with the gates opened and the path exposed to public use, the children would come. One morning I stood beside the front door, looking out through the narrow pane of glass, and saw children playing on our front lawn. Perhaps the parents had sent them to explore the way and make sure it was navigable, or perhaps children can never resist playing anywhere. They seemed a little uneasy playing in front of our house, and their voices were subdued. I thought that perhaps they were only pretending to play, because they were children and were supposed to play, but perhaps they were actually sent here to look for us, thinly disguised as children. They were not really convincing, I decided as I watched them. They moved gracelessly and never once glanced, that I could see, at our house. I wondered how soon they would creep onto the porch and press their small faces against the shutters, trying to see through cracks. Constance came up behind me and looked out over my shoulder. They are the children of the strangers, I told her. They have no faces. They have eyes. Pretend they are birds. They can't see us. They don't know it yet. They don't want to believe it. But they won't ever see us again. I suppose that now they've come once, they'll come again. All the strangers will come, but they can't see inside. And now, may I please have my breakfast? The kitchen was always dark in the mornings until I bolted the kitchen door and opened it to let the sunlight in. Then Jonas went to sit on the step and bathe, and Constance sang while she made our breakfast. After breakfast, I sat on the step with Jonas while Constance washed the kitchen. Barricading the sides of the house had been easier than I expected. I managed it one night with Constance holding a flashlight for me. At either side of our house, there was a spot where the trees and bushes grew close to the house, sheltering the back and narrowing the path, which was the only way around. I brought piece after piece from the pile of junk Mr. Harler had made on our front porch, and heaped the broken boards and furniture across the narrowest spot. It would not really keep anyone out, of course. The children could climb over it easily, but if anyone did try to get past, there would be enough noise and falling of broken boards to give us plenty of time to close and bolt the kitchen door. I had found some boards across the tool shed and nailed them rudely across the glass of the kitchen door, but I disliked putting them across the sides of the house as a barricade, where anyone might see them and know how clumsily I built. Perhaps, I told myself, I might try my hand at mending the broken step. What are you laughing about now? Constance asked me. I am thinking that we are on the moon, but it is not quite as I supposed it would be. It's a very happy place, though. Constance was bringing breakfast to the table, scrambled eggs and toasted biscuits and blackberry jam she had made some golden summer. We ought to bring in as much food as we can, she said. I don't like to think of the garden waiting there for us to come and gather growing things. I'd feel much better if we had more food put securely away in the house. I will go on my winged horse and bring you cinnamon and thyme, emeralds and clove, cloth of gold and cabbages and rhubarb. We were able to leave the kitchen door open when we went down to the vegetable garden because we could see clearly whether anyone was approaching by barricades and run back to the house if we needed to. I carried the basket, and we brought back lettuce, still grey with ash, and radishes, and tomatoes, and cucumbers, and later berries and melons. Usually I ate fruit and vegetables still moist from the ground and the air, but I disliked eating anything while it was still dirty with the ash from a burnt house. Most of the dirt and soot had blown away, and the air around the garden was fresh and clean, but the smoke was in the ground, and I thought it would always be there. As soon as we were safely settled, Constance had opened Uncle Julian's room and cleaned it. She brought out the sheets from Uncle Julian's bed and the blankets, washed them in the kitchen sink, and set them outside to dry in the sunlight. "What are you going to do with Uncle Julian's papers?" I asked her, and she rested her hands against the edge of the sink, hesitating. "I suppose I'll keep them all in a box," she said at last. "I suppose I'll put the box down in the cellar." "And preserve it?" "And preserve it. He would like to think that his papers were treated respectfully, and I would not want Uncle Julian to suspect that his papers were not preserved. I had better go and see that the front door is locked." The children were often outside, on our front lawn, playing their still games, and not looking at our house, moving awkwardly in little dashing runs, and slapping one another without cause. Whenever I checked to make sure that the front door was locked, I looked out to see if the children were there. Very often I saw people walking on our path now, using it to go from one place to another, and putting their feet down where once only my feet had gone. And I thought, they used the path without wanting to, as though each of them had to travel it once to show that it could be done. But I thought that only a few, the defiant, hating ones, came by more than once. I dreamed away the long afternoon while Constance cleaned Uncle Julian's room. I sat on the doorsill with Jonas asleep beside me and looked out on the quiet, safe garden. "Look, Merricat," Constance said, coming to me with an armful of clothes. "Look, Uncle Julian had 2 suits and a topcoat and a hat. He walked upright once. He told us so himself. I can just barely remember him years ago going off one day to buy a suit, and I suppose it was one of these suits he bought. They are neither of them much worn." What would he have been wearing on that last day with them? What tie did he have on at dinner? He would surely like to have it remembered. She looked at me for a minute, not smiling. "It would hardly have been one of these. When I came to get him afterwards at the hospital, he was wearing pajamas and a robe. Perhaps he should have one of these suits now." He was probably buried in an old suit of Jim Clark's. Constance started for the cellar and then stopped. "Merricat?" "Yes, Constance?" "Do you realize that these things of Uncle Julian's are the only clothes left in our house? All of mine are burned, and all of yours, and everything of theirs in the attic. I have only this pink dress I have on," and I looked down, "and I am wearing brown, and yours needs washing and mending. How can you tear your clothes so, my Merricat?" "I shall weave a suit of leaves at once with acorns for buttons." "Merricat, be serious. We will have to wear Uncle Julian's clothes." "I am not allowed to touch Uncle Julian's things. I shall have a lining of moss for cold winter days and a hat made of bird feathers." "That may be all very well for the moon, Miss Foolishness. On the moon you may wear a suit of fur like Jonas for all of me, but right here in our house you are going to be clothed in one of your uncle's old shirts, and perhaps his trousers too." Or Uncle Julian's bathrobe and pajamas, I suppose. No, I am not allowed to touch Uncle Julian's things. I will wear leaves. But you are allowed. I tell you that you are allowed. No. She sighed. Well, she said, you'll probably see me wearing them. Then she stopped and laughed and looked at me and laughed again. Constance? I said. She put Uncle Julian's clothes over the back of a chair and, still laughing, went into the pantry and opened one of the drawers. I remembered what she was after, and I laughed too. Then she came back and put an armload of tablecloths down beside me. These will do you very nicely, elegant Merricat. Look, how will you feel in this, with a border of yellow flowers, or this handsome red and white check? The damask, I'm afraid, is too stiff for comfort, and besides, it has been darned. I stood up and held the red and white check tablecloth against me. You can cut a hole for my head, I said. I was pleased. I have no sewing things. You will simply have to tie it around your waist with a cord or let it hang like a toga. I will use the damask for a cloak. Who else wears a damask cloak? Merricat. Oh, Merricat. Constance dropped the tablecloth she was holding and put her arms around me. What have I done to my baby, Merricat? She said. No house, no food, and dressed in a tablecloth. What have I done? Constance, I said. I love you, Constance. Dressed in a tablecloth like a rag doll. Constance, we're going to be very happy, Constance. Oh, Merricat, she said, holding me. Listen to me, Constance. We are going to be very happy. I dressed at once, not wanting to give Constance more time to think. I chose the red and white check, and when Constance had cut a hole for my head, I took my gold cord with the tassel that Constance had cut from the drawing-room drapes and tied it around for a belt, and looked, I thought, very fine. Constance was sad at first, and turned away when she saw me, and scrubbed furiously at the sink to get my brown dress clean. But I liked my robe, and danced in it, and before long she smiled again, and then laughed at me. Robinson Crusoe dressed in the skins of animals, I told her. He had no gay cloths with a gold belt. I must say, you never looked so bright before. You will be wearing the skins of Uncle Julian. I prefer my tablecloth. I believe the one you are wearing now was used for summer breakfasts on the lawn many years ago. Red and white check would never be used in the dining room, of course. Some days I shall be a summer breakfast on the lawn, and some days I shall be a formal dinner by candlelight, and some days I shall be a very dirty Merricat. You have a fine gown, but your face is dirty. We have lost almost everything, young lady, but at least we still have clean water and a comb. One thing was most lucky about Uncle Julian's room. I persuaded Constance to bring out his chair and wheel it through the garden to reinforce my barricade. It looked strange to see Constance wheeling the empty chair, and for a minute I tried to see Uncle Julian again, riding with his hands in his lap, but all that remained of Uncle Julian's presence were the worn spots on the chair, and a handkerchief tucked under the cushion. The chair would be powerful in my barricade, however, staring out always at intruders with a blank menace of dead Uncle Julian. I was troubled to think that Uncle Julian might vanish altogether, with his papers in a box, and his chair on the barricade, and his toothbrush thrown away, and even the smell of Uncle Julian gone from his room. But when the ground was soft, Constance planted a yellow rose bush at Uncle Julian's spot on the lawn, and one night I went down to the creek and buried Uncle Julian's initialed gold pencil by the water, so the creek would always speak his name. Jonas took to going into Uncle Julian's room, where he had never gone before. But I did not go inside. Helen Clark came to our door twice more, knocking and calling and begging us to answer. But we sat quietly, And when she found that she could not come around the house because of my barricade, she told us from the front door that she would not come back, and she did not. One evening, perhaps the evening of the day Constance planted Uncle Julian's rose bush, we heard a very soft knock at our front door while we sat at the table eating dinner. It was far too soft a knock for Helen Clark, and I left the table and hurried silently down the hall to be sure that the front door was locked. And Constance followed me, curious. We pressed silently against the door and listened. "Miss Blackwood," someone said outside in a low voice. I wondered if he suspected we were so close to him. "Miss Constance? Miss Mary Katherine?" It was not quite dark outside, but inside where we stood we could only see one another dimly, two white faces against the door. "Miss Constance," he said again. "Listen." I thought that he was moving his head from side to side to make sure that he was not seen. "Listen," he said. "I got a chicken here." He tapped softly on the door. "I hope you can hear me," he said. "I got a chicken here. My wife fixed it, roasted it nice, and there's some cookies and a pie. I hope you can hear me." I could see that Constance's eyes were wide with wonder. I stared at her, and she stared at me. "I sure hope you can hear me, Miss Blackwood. I broke one of your chairs, and I'm sorry." He tapped against the door again, very softly. "Well," he said, "I'll just set this basket down on your step here. I hope you heard me. Goodbye." We listened to quiet footsteps going away. And after a minute, Constance said, "What shall we do? Shall we open the door?" "Later," I said. "I'll come when it's really dark." I wonder what kind of pie it is. Do you think it's as good as my pies? We finished our dinner and waited until I was sure that no one could possibly see the front door opening. And then we went down the hall, and I unlocked the door and looked inside. The basket sat on the doorstep, covered with a napkin. I brought it inside and locked the door. Well, Constance took the basket from me and carried it into the kitchen. "Blueberry," she said when I came. "Quite good, too. It's still warm." She took out the chicken, wrapped in a napkin, and a little package of cookies, touching each lovingly and with gentleness. "Everything's still warm," she said. "She must have baked them right after dinner, so he could bring them right over. I wonder if she made 2 pies, one for the house. She wrapped everything while it was still warm and told him to bring them over. These cookies are not crisp enough. I'll take the basket back and leave it on the porch so he'll know we found it." "No, no," Constance caught me by the arm. "Not until I've washed the napkins. What would she think of me?" Sometimes they brought bacon, home-cured, or fruit, or their own preserves, which were never as good as the preserves Constance made. Mostly they brought roasted chicken, sometimes a cake or a pie, frequently cookies, sometimes a potato salad or coleslaw. Once they brought a pot of beef stew, which Constance took apart and put back together again, according to her own rules for beef stew. And sometimes there were pots of baked beans or macaroni. "We are the biggest church supper they've ever had," Constance said once, looking at a loaf of homemade bread I had just brought inside. These things were always left on the front doorstep, always silently, and in the evenings. We thought that the men came home from work and the women had the baskets ready for them to carry over. Perhaps they came in darkness, not to be recognized, as though each of them wanted to hide from the others, and bringing us food was somehow a shameful thing to do in public. There were many women cooking. Constance said, "Here's one," she explained to me once, tasting a bean, "who uses ketchup and too much of it, and the last one used more molasses. Once or twice there was a note in the basket. 'This is for the dishes,' or 'We apologize about the curtains,' or 'Sorry for your harp.' We always set the baskets back where we had found them and never opened the front door until it was completely dark, and we were sure that no one was near. I always checked carefully afterwards to make certain that the front door was locked. I discovered that I was no longer allowed to go to the creek. Uncle Julian was there, and it was much too far from Constance. I never went farther than the edge of the woods, and Constance went only as far as the vegetable garden. I was not allowed to bury anything anymore, nor was I allowed to touch stone. Every day, I looked over the boards across the kitchen windows, and when I found small cracks, I nailed on more boards. Every morning, I checked at once to make sure the front door was locked, and every morning Constance washed the kitchen. We spent a good deal of time at the front door, particularly during the afternoons, when most people came by. We sat, one on either side of the front door, looking out through the narrow glass panels, which I had covered almost entirely with cardboard, so that we had each only a small peephole, and no one could possibly see inside. We watched the children playing and the people walking past, and we heard their voices, and they were all strangers, with their wide staring eyes and their evil open mouths. One day, a group came by bicycle. There were 2 women and a man and 2 children. They parked their bicycles in our driveway and lay down on our front lawn, pulling at the grass and talking while they rested. The children ran up and down our driveway and over and around the trees and bushes. This was the day that we learned that the vines were growing over the burned roof of our house, because one of the women glanced sideways at the house and said that the vines almost hid the marks of burning. They rarely turned squarely to look at our house face to face, but looked from the corners of their eyes or from over a shoulder or through their fingers. "It used to be such a lovely old house, I hear," said the woman sitting on our grass. "I've heard it was quite a local landmark at one time." "Now it looks like a tomb," the other woman said. "Shh," the first woman said, and gestured toward the house with her head. "I heard," she said loudly, "that they had a staircase which was very fine, carved in Italy, I heard." "They can't hear you," the other woman said, amused, "and who cares if they do anyway? Shh, no one knows for sure if there's anyone inside or not. The local people tell some tall tales." "Shh, Tommy," she called to one of the children, "don't you go near those steps." "Why?" said the child, backing away. "Because the ladies live in there, and they don't like it." "Why?" said the child, pausing at the foot of the steps and giving a quick look backward at our front door. "The ladies don't like little boys," the second woman said. She was one of the bad ones. I could see her mouth from the side, and it was the mouth of a snake. "What would they do to me?" "They'd hold you down and make you eat candy full of poison. I heard that dozens of bad little boys have gone too near that house and never been seen again. They catch little boys and they—" "Shh, honestly, Ethel, do they like little girls?" The other child drew near. "They hate little boys and little girls. The difference is they eat the little girls." "Ethel, stop. You're terrifying the children. It isn't true, darling. She's only teasing you." "They never come out except at night," the bad woman said, looking evilly at the children. "And then, when it's dark, they go hunting little children." "Just the same," the man said suddenly, "I don't want to see the kids going too near that house." Charles Blackwood came back only once. He came in a car with another man late one afternoon when we had been watching for a long time. All the strangers had gone, and Constance had just stirred and said, "Time to put on the potatoes," when the car turned into the driveway and she settled back to watch again. Charles and the other man got out of the car in front of the house and walked directly to the foot of the steps, looking up, although they could not see us inside. I remembered the first time Charles had come and stood looking up at our house in just the same manner. But this time he would never get in. I reached up and touched the lock on the front door to make sure it was fastened. And on the other side of the doorway, Constance turned and nodded to me. She knew, too, that Charles would never get in again. "See," Charles said, outside at the foot of our steps. "There's the house, just like I said. It doesn't look as bad as it did. Now the vines have grown so, but the roof's been burned away and the place was gutted inside." "Are the ladies in there?" "Sure." Charles laughed, and I remembered his laughter and his big, staring white face. And from inside the door I wished him dead. They're in there all right," he said. "And so is a whole damn fortune." "You know that?" "They've got money in there's never been counted. They've got it buried all over, and a safe full, and God knows where else they've hidden it. They never come out, just hide away inside with all that money." "Look," the other man said, "they know you, don't they?" "Sure. I'm their cousin. I came here on a visit once." "You think there's any chance you might get one of them to talk to you? Maybe come to the window or something so I could get a picture?" Charles thought. He looked at the house and at the other man and thought, "If you sell this to the magazine or somewhere, do I get half?" "Sure. It's a promise." "I'll try it," Charles said. "You get back behind the car out of sight. They certainly won't come out if they see a stranger." The other man went back to the car and took out a camera and settled himself on the other side of the car where we could not see him. "Okay," he called, and Charles started up the steps to our front door. "Connie," he called. "Hey, Connie, it's Charles. I'm back." I looked at Constance and thought she had never seen Charles so truly before. "Connie!" She knew now that Charles was a ghost and a demon, one of the strangers. "Let's forget all that happened," Charles said. He came close to the door and spoke pleasantly with a little pleading tone. "Let's be friends again." I could see his feet. One of them was tapping and tapping on the floor of our porch. "I don't know what you've got against me," he said, "and I've been waiting and waiting for you to let me know I could come back again. If I did anything to offend you, I'm really sorry." I wished Charles could see inside, could see us sitting on the floor on either side of the front door, listening to him and looking at his feet, while he talked beggingly to the door 3 feet above our heads. "Open the door," he said very softly. "Connie, will you open the door for me, for Cousin Charles?" Constance looked up where his face must be and smiled unpleasantly. I thought it must be a smile she had been saving for Charles if he ever came back again. "I went to see old Julian's grave this morning," Charles said. "I came back to visit old Julian's grave and to see you once more." He waited a minute and then said with a little break in his voice, "I put a couple of flowers, you know, on the old fellow's grave. He was a fine old guy, and he was always pretty good to me." Beyond Charles's feet, I saw the other man coming out from behind the car with his camera. "Look," he called, "you're wasting your breath, and I haven't got all day." "Don't you understand?" Charles had turned away from the door, but his voice still had that little break in it. "I've got to see her once more. I was the cause of it all." "What?" "Why do you suppose 2 old maids shut themselves up in a house like that? God knows," Charles said. "I didn't mean it to turn out this way." I thought Constance was going to speak then, or at least laugh out loud, and I reached across and touched her arm, warning her to be quiet. But she did not turn her head to me. "If I could just talk to her," Charles said. "You can get some pictures of the house anyway, with me standing here or knocking at the door. I could be knocking frantically at the door. You could be stretched out across the doorsill dying of a broken heart for all of me," the other man said. He went to the car and put his camera inside. Waste of time. And all that money, Connie, Charles called loudly. Will you, for heaven's sake, open that door? You know, the other man said from the car, I just bet you're never going to see those silver dollars again. Connie, Charles said, you don't know what you're doing to me. I never deserved to be treated like this. Please, Connie. You want to walk back to town? The other man said. He closed the car door. Charles turned away from the door and then turned back. All right, Connie, he said, this is it. If you let me go this time, you will never see me again. I mean it, Connie. I'm leaving, the other man said from the car. I mean it, Connie. I really do. Charles started down the steps, talking over his shoulder. Take a last look, he said. I'm going. One word could make me stay. I did not think he was going to go in time. I honestly did not know whether Constance was going to be able to contain herself until he got down the steps and safely into the car. Goodbye, Connie, he said from the foot of the steps, and then turned away and went slowly toward the car. He looked for a minute as though he might wipe his eyes or blow his nose. But the other man said, Hurry up. And Charles looked back once more, raised his hand sadly, and got into the car. Then Constance laughed, and I laughed, and for a minute I saw Charles in the car turn his head quickly as though he had heard us laughing. But the car started and drove off down the driveway, and we held each other in the dark hall and laughed, with the tears running down our cheeks and echoes of our laughter going up the ruined stairway to the sky. I am so happy, Constance said at last, gasping. Oh, Merricat, I am so happy. I told you that you would like it on the moon. The Carringtons stopped their car in front of our house one Sunday after church and sat quietly in the car, looking at our house, as though supposing that we would come out if there was anything the Carringtons could do for us. Sometimes I thought of the drawing room and the dining room, forever closed away, with our mother's lovely broken things lying scattered, and the dust sifting gently down to cover them. We had new landmarks in the house, just as we had a new pattern for our days. The crooked, broken-off fragment, which was all that was left of our lovely stairway, was something we passed every day and came to know as intimately as we had once known the stairs themselves. The boards across the kitchen windows were ours and part of our house, and we loved them. We were very happy, although Constance was always in terror lest one of our 2 cups should break and one of us have to use a cup without a handle. We had our well-known and familiar places, our chairs at the table, and our beds, and our places beside the front door. Constance washed the red and white tablecloth and the shirts of Uncle Julian's, which she wore, and while they were hanging in the garden to dry, I wore a tablecloth with a yellow border, which looked very handsome with my gold belt. Our mother's old brown shoes were safely put away in my corner of the kitchen, since in the warm summer days I went barefoot, like Jonas. Constance disliked picking many flowers, but there was always a bowl on the kitchen table, with roses or daisies, although, of course, she never picked a rose from Uncle Julian's rose bush. I sometimes thought of my 6 blue marbles, but I was not allowed to go to the long field now, and I thought that perhaps my 6 blue marbles had been buried to protect a house which no longer existed and had no connection with the house where we lived now, and where we were very happy. My new magical safeguards were the lock on the front door, and the boards over the windows, and the barricades along the side of the house. In the evenings, sometimes we saw movement in the darkness on the lawn, and heard whispers. Don't! The ladies might be watching. You think they can see in the dark? I heard they see everything that goes on. Then there might be laughter, drifting away into the warm darkness. They will soon be calling this Lover's Lane, Constance said. After Charles, no doubt. Oh, The least Charles could have done, Constance said, considering seriously, was shoot himself through the head in the driveway. We learned from listening that all strangers could see from outside, when they looked at all, was a great ruined structure, overgrown with vines, barely recognizable as a house. It was the point halfway between the village and the highway, the middle spot on the path, and no one ever saw our eyes looking out through the vines. "You can't go on those steps," the children warned each other. "If you do, the ladies will get you." Once a boy, dared by the others, stood at the foot of the steps facing the house, and shivered, and almost cried and almost ran away, and then called out shakily, "Mary Cat," said Constance, "would you like a cup of tea?" And then fled, followed by all the others. That night we found on the doorsill a basket of fresh eggs and a note reading, "He didn't mean it, please." "Poor child," Constance said, putting the eggs into a bowl to go into the cooler. "He's probably hiding under the bed right now." "Perhaps he had a good whipping to teach him manners." "We will have an omelet for breakfast." "I wonder if I could eat a child, if I had the chance." "I doubt if I could cook one," said Constance. "Poor strangers," I said. "They have so much to be afraid of." "Well," Constance said, "I am afraid of spiders." "Jonas and I will see to it that no spider ever comes near you." "Oh, Constance," I said, "we are so happy." The end.